British Empire ruled for almost 400 years with an iron fist, using cruel punishments to keep people and colonies in line. These punishments were not just harsh, they were terrifying. Designed to break both the body and the spirit, they demonstrated the empire's power and sent chilling messages to anyone who dared to disobey. From brutal beatings to public humiliation, the methods were as creative as they were horrifying. Here are some of the most shocking and disgusting punishments ever used in its dark history. Floggings. From the early days of colonialism, harsh penalties were the norm, often targeting both criminals and dissenters. One particularly notorious method was the practice of floggings, which means whipping someone as a punishment. They used tools like whips, rods, and even a scary tool called the cat o' nine tails. Sometimes, people were punished against their will, but other times, they chose it. Strange as it sounds, some did it for religious reasons, or because they wanted to. Usually, the whipping happened on a person's bare back, but sometimes it was on other parts of the body, like the feet. When the feet were whipped, it was called bastinado. This kind of punishment was common in many places, especially in Britain, where whipping was often called the English vice. In the old days, the British Navy used flogging to keep sailors in line. If someone broke the rules on a ship, they might get whipped with the cat o' nine tails. The number of lashes depended on what they did. On average, sailors got about 19 lashes, but some captains, like Thomas Masterman Hardy, gave out much harsher punishments. For serious crimes, sailors could get up to 60 lashes. If someone did something really bad, they might be flogged around the fleet. This meant they were whipped on several ships, one after the other, for everyone to see. In 1879, there was a big debate in Britain about stopping flogging in the Navy. One member of Parliament, John O'Connor Power, even asked for a cat o' nine tails to be brought into the room so everyone could see how cruel it was. This moment, called the Great Cat Contention, helped convince people to vote to end flogging. During the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers in the British Army also faced harsh punishments. They could get hundreds of lashes for breaking the rules. Some were sentenced to 1,200 lashes, which could seriously hurt or even kill them. One soldier was punished with 700 lashes just for stealing a beehive. These harsh punishments often left people feeling angry and hopeless. Even good soldiers could lose their self-respect after being whipped. Not all armies used flogging. The King's German Legion, a group of German soldiers working for Britain, refused to whip their men. Once, when a British soldier under their command was sentenced to be flogged, the German officer refused to carry it out. This showed that not everyone believed flogging was right. Even after flogging was banned in many places, it didn't disappear completely. In Northern Ireland, a law passed in 1922 allowed whipping for certain crimes. One man, Frank Morris, remembered getting 15 lashes with the cat o' nine tails in 1942. He said the pain was unbearable, but he refused to scream. This law stayed in place till 1973. Another unsettling punishment was the rack, one of the scariest torture devices ever made. The rack. This heinous punishment came to England in the 15th century because of the Duke of Exeter. He was in charge of the Tower of London, so people started calling the rack the Duke of Exeter's Daughter. But don't let the name fool you. It wasn't gentle at all. Here's how it worked. A person was tied down on a big, rectangle-shaped frame. Ropes were wrapped around their wrists and ankles, keeping them in place. These ropes were attached to a crank, a kind of handle that could be turned to make the ropes tighter and tighter. As the crank turned, The ropes pulled harder, stretching the person's body. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was pure pain. The stretching could pull the joints out of place, snap important body parts called ligaments, and even rip arms or legs off. This horrible device wasn't just used for fun, it was part of interrogations. People tied to the rack were usually asked questions. If they didn't answer, the crank was turned again, making the pain even worse. Most couldn't stand the torture for long. They would eventually give up and tell their secrets, just to make it stop. The rack was a cruel invention, leaving behind broken bodies and terrible stories. It's a reminder of how far people went to get answers back in those days. The rack wasn't the only terrifying tool from medieval times. Scavengers Daughter. If the rack has you running for the hills, wait till you find out what yeoman warders at the Tower of London also used as a torture device during the 16th and 17th centuries. Known as the Scavengers Daughter, this next torture device was an equal and opposite of the infamous rack. Also called the Skevington's gyves, iron shackle, stalk, or Spanish A-frame, it was a type of torture device invented during the reign of King Henry VIII of England. It was invented by Sir Leonard Skevington, Lieutenant of the Tower of London. The device was metal-shaped into an A-frame. The victim's head was strapped to the top point of the A, the hands at the midpoint, and the legs at the lower spread end. That compressed the victim's body in on itself, so it contorted the victims instead of stretching them. Compression from the Scavenger's Daughter was so intense, it could apparently cause the victim to start bleeding from the nose, mouth, and other parts of the body. This gruesome form of torture could result in death. Today, there are two versions that you can see. The duplicate in the Wakefield Tower that binds the body tightly in a kneeling down position, which would be extremely uncomfortable and cause the lungs to fill with blood. The other version, found in the Spanish armories of the White Tower, is a complex set of handcuffs that also grip the victim's neck and ankles, twisting them into an agonizing posture. The most well-documented use is on Irishman Thomas Mayo, who was accused of communicating with rebels in Ireland. Mayo etched on the wall of the Beauchamp Tower in the Tower of London, "By torture strange, my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied." 1581. Thomas Mee. And historians think this could be referring to the Scavenger's Daughter. Another victim of the Scavenger's Daughter was Thomas Cottam, an English Catholic priest and martyr from Lancashire, who suffered twice in the 1580s before being released. Judas Cradle. Another spine-chilling device was the Judas Cradle, also called the Judas Chair. Just one look at it could make people shake with fear. Back then, even the threat of this awful thing was enough to make someone confess to whatever the torturers wanted to hear. The Judas Cradle was shaped like a pyramid, with a sharp, pointy top. Here's what would happen. A person was tied up and slowly lowered onto the pyramid's tip using ropes. The sharp point pressed against their body, and their own weight pushed it in deeper. Over time, the tip would tear through their pelvis, causing unbearable pain. This horrible device wasn't just a rare nightmare, it showed up in different forms across medieval Europe. Historical records tell us that the Judas Cradle was used in many places, though its design changed a bit from region to region. The thought of being near the Judas Cradle made people so scared that they'd often confess to anything just to avoid it. Torturers didn't even need to use it most of the time. The mere sight of the spiky pyramid was enough to break someone's will. Eaten by the flames. The rack and the Judas Cradle were terrifying, But some punishments were even worse. In medieval times, people who were accused of things like petty treason or heresy could be burned alive on a huge bonfire. King Henry VII, who ruled from 1485 to 1509, even had 11 people burned because they believed in something called Lollard teachings, which were seen as wrong or heretical at the time. The Lollards were a group of people who disagreed with the church. They were so hated for their beliefs that they were often taken to their execution on a horse-drawn cart. The image of these Lollards being taken to their death in England during the mid-14th century shows just how dangerous it was to speak out or believe in something different back then. But that wasn't all. In some places, the way criminals were punished could change, depending on where they were. For example, in Dover, people who were found guilty could be thrown from the cliffs, a horrifying way to meet their end. In Sandwich, things were just as grim. People might be buried alive as punishment for their crimes. The fear of these punishments made people live in constant worry. It wasn't just about what you did, it was about who thought you did something wrong. Even speaking or believing in different ideas could cost you your life. Bloody Code. In 1723, Britain created a system called the Bloody Code, which made over 200 crimes punishable by death. Some of these crimes were pretty surprising and small, like stealing a sheep or damaging a garden. One law called the Waltham Black Act was made to stop people from sneaking into royal forests and stealing deer, but it also made many other actions punishable by death, like disguising yourself with black paint on your face. Over time, more laws were added, making even more actions crimes that could lead to the death penalty. For example, destroying a bridge could get you killed, and if you set fire to something or stole a horse, that was also a death sentence. The rules kept growing and became more confusing, as there were many laws for each kind of crime. Some laws had multiple rules within them. For example, if you started a fire, there were 7 different laws about it, and each one could lead to the death penalty. Some of the surprising things that could get you hanged were stealing from a shipwreck, stealing a rabbit, or even stealing something worth just a shilling, which is about £30 today. There were also laws that punish people for things like walking around at night with their face painted black, or being an unmarried mother who secretly hid a stillborn baby. Even though there were more than hundreds of crimes that could lead to death, juries didn't always agree with the laws. Many times, juries didn't want to sentence someone to death, so fewer people were actually hanged than the laws said should be. But eventually, a man named Sir Samuel Romilly worked hard to change the Bloody Code. After a lot of fighting for change, he helped get rid of the death penalty for some minor crimes. As time went on, other punishments, like being sent to prison or transported to another land, became more common instead of death. Execution by firing squad. During times of war, execution by firing squad was used for serious crimes like desertion or spying. Back in history, especially during the World Wars, firing squads played a significant role in military justice. The Tower of London, a famous historic site, became a grim stage for such executions. During World War I, 11 German spies were captured and shot there between 1914 and 1916. 9 were executed on the tower's rifle range, and 2 met their fate in the Tower Ditch. They were all buried at the East London Cemetery. The last execution at the Tower happened on August 15, 1941. Joseph Jacobs, a German corporal, was found guilty of spying during World War II and was shot. His chair still stands as a chilling reminder of that day. But not all executions told a straightforward story of guilt. During World War I, 346 British and Imperial soldiers were executed for desertion, cowardice, and other crimes. Among them were 25 Canadians, 22 Irish soldiers, and 5 from New Zealand. Many of these soldiers were later believed to have suffered from combat stress, called shell shock back then. They were likely scared, confused, or deeply traumatized by the horrors of war. Years later, groups like the Shot at Dawn campaign worked hard to uncover the truth about these executions. Their efforts helped honor those soldiers and shed light on the unfair treatment they faced. A memorial called the Shot at Dawn Memorial was built in Staffordshire to remember them. Finally, in 2006, the British government granted pardons to 306 of these soldiers, giving them the respect and recognition they deserved. Peine forte et dure. While firing squads were a scary part of history, there was another frightening punishment called peine forte et dure that shows how harsh things used to be. This terrifying punishment called peine forte et dure means forceful and hard punishment in Old French. This gruesome method was used when someone refused to say whether they were guilty or not. The person was laid on the ground, and heavy stones or iron were piled onto their chest. The pressure kept building until they either gave in and spoke, or they couldn't breathe anymore. This strange punishment came about because courts believed they couldn't judge someone who didn't ask for a trial. But many people stayed silent on purpose. Why? If they refused to plead, their family could still inherit their land. But if they admitted guilt, all their property went to the crown, leaving their family with nothing. Over time, this punishment became rare. It was officially banned in 1772. By then, staying silent was treated as if the person pleaded guilty. Later, in 1827, the law changed again, treating silence as a not guilty plea. One famous case involved a woman named Margaret Clitheroe. In 1586, she chose silence to protect her children from testifying against her. She was pressed to death under 700 pounds of weight and died within 15 minutes. In America, during the Salem witch trials, Giles Corey suffered the same fate in 1692. Legend says his final words, as the crushing weight was added, were, "More weight." Such punishments may seem unbelievable today, but they remind us how justice has changed over time. Banishment. Banishment, or sending someone away from their home country, became a popular punishment in the 1700s. Instead of facing the death penalty, criminals were sent far, far away. This was called transportation. At first, criminals from Britain were sent to America between 1717 and 1776. But when that stopped, Australia became the new destination. From 1787 to 1868, over 160,000 convicts were transported there. Judges liked this option because it was less harsh than death, but still removed the criminal from Britain. Plus, it was cheaper than keeping people in overcrowded prisons or hulks, old ships turned into jails. Sending convicts to Australia wasn't just about punishment. It also helped Britain take control of the land and build up its colonies. Before Captain Cook discovered Australia in 1770, British prisons were bursting at the seams. Transportation gave criminals a one-way ticket to a new rugged place where they couldn't cause trouble back home. But transportation wasn't an easy escape. Sentences were long, 7 years, 40 years, or even life. The journey to Australia was tough, with harsh conditions on the ships. Once they arrived, convicts had to work hard in rough environments. Authorities hoped this would scare others into following the law. At the same time, they thought the hard work might change the criminals for the better. By 1868, transportation came to an end. People began to think differently about punishment. It wasn't just about getting rid of criminals anymore. It was about helping them change. Reform and rehabilitation became the focus. Besides, free settlers in Australia were unhappy. They didn't like having so many convicts sent to their new homes, especially when more and more British families were paying to move there for a fresh start. Scolds bridal. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, punishment wasn't just about breaking the law, it could also target behavior society didn't like. In England and Scotland, one group of people often found themselves in trouble. Women who gossiped or spoke too much. They were called scolds, and people thought they were causing trouble in their neighborhoods with their loud words and harsh stories. Today, a stern "stop it" might be enough to handle gossip, but back then, something far harsher was used. It was called the scold's bridle, or sometimes branks. This device was created to silence women considered too noisy or unruly. It was not only painful, but also meant to embarrass the wearer in front of everyone. The scold's bridle looked like a mask, but it wasn't the kind you'd want to wear. Sometimes it had creepy features, like horns or twisted designs that made it look scary. The worst part? Inside the mask was a sharp metal piece that pressed down on the woman's tongue, making it impossible for her to speak. It didn't just hurt, it forced her to stay silent, no matter how much she wanted to talk. Women forced to wear this cruel device had to walk around town, humiliated, while everyone could see them. The idea was to teach them a lesson and make them afraid to gossip or speak loudly again. But it wasn't just about stopping their words. It was a way for society to control women who didn't fit the mold of being quiet and obedient. Cucking and ducking stool. After the scold's bridle, you'd think punishments couldn't get any worse, but history has a way of surprising us. Starting as early as the 13th century, England introduced the cucking stool, and later, in the 17th century, the even harsher ducking stool. These strange and cruel devices weren't just used to punish women, but they're most famous for targeting them, especially women accused of being witches, behaving badly, or breaking society's rules. The cucking stool was a public punishment designed to humiliate. It looked like an old wooden toilet, and whoever was forced to sit on it had to be tied in place. Once restrained, the person was paraded through town, where crowds would jeer and laugh. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was meant to make people feel ashamed in front of their entire community. But as bad as that sounds, the ducking stool was even more terrifying. Imagine sitting in a chair, tied to a long wooden beam over a river or pond. Once strapped in, the chair was dunked into the water. The poor person had to hold their breath and pray they were pulled back up in time. If the person survived the dunking, it was considered punishment enough. But if they didn't, especially in cases of witchcraft, the drowning was seen as proof of their innocence. Yes, you read that right. Drowning meant they weren't guilty, but it also meant they didn't survive to hear the verdict. This cruel logic was part of the darker side of history. Women accused of being witches had almost no way to defend themselves. If they floated, people said they were witches. If they sank, they were declared innocent, but only after they had drowned. Gibbeting. As history goes on, the cruel British Empire's punishments keep getting harsher and more inhumane than ever. If you thought the ducking stool was cruel, wait until you hear about gibbeting, a punishment that didn't just hurt, but left a lasting mark forever. A gibbet was a scary tool used during the harsh rule of the British Empire. It could mean any place for public executions, like a guillotine a chopping block, or a stake. But gibbeting was when a criminal's dead body was hung on a special frame called gallows for everyone to see. In a place called Winter's Gibbet in Elsdon, Northumberland, there's a story about a man named William Winter. In 1792, he was hanged in Newcastle because he had killed an old woman. After he was executed, his body was hung up in chains on the gibbet. People say his body stayed there for many years, rotting away until the structure fell apart. Then, in 1867, someone built a replica on the same spot. They even added a wooden figure to show what it looked like. Over time, parts of the wooden figure, like the body and head, went missing. Now only a short chain is left to remind people of what happened there. Long ago, folks believed pieces of the gibbet could heal toothaches. They thought if you rubbed the wood on your gums, the pain would go away. In Suffolk, at Potsford Woods near Wickham Market, you can still see the remains of an old gibbet. Another sad story is tied to this place. A man named Jonah Snell killed another man and his son while they were working. When Jonah was caught, he still had the weapon he used to hurt them. He was sentenced to death. It's said that Jonah was dragged on his back up a hill to the gibbet. Because of this, the hill is now called Dragas Hill. We hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more amazing stories.